everyone. I have to use this microphone, even though I got down here today. I was like, oh, we're all really close. But we're recording these, so that's why my big mouth is using this microphone this morning. Let's start with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we find ourselves often in places of wilderness, and yet even in challenging times, we find comfort in your presence always. Here in this church and with our fellow community of believers, thank you for the gifts and the grace and the peace that you bring into our lives at all times. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, well, thanks for coming. So, last fall, the fall we just had, I was on sabbatical last summer, and a big chunk of my sabbatical I spent kind of wandering around in the wilderness of British Columbia, right? And so when it came to fall and thinking about classes for Lent, it was still kind of on my mind, that time that I had been through and in. And so I kind of thought about a class along those lines. Those kind of wilderness stories struck a tone with me because while I was in my wilderness wanderings, as I called them, if you read my article about them, I read wilderness stories from the Bible as part of that. And so all of these pieces kind of came together, and I'm not sure how, but exactly or why we worked on it as a group, and it kind of came to the idea that we would talk about the people in the Bible who found themselves in wilderness experiences throughout our Lenten journey. Lent being a time, obviously, of kind of wrestling, preparation, all of those things, which kind of coincide and link up well with wilderness. And so that was the idea, that we would take a different person from the Bible and we would look at their story. And honestly, I didn't think about how exactly it would go from there. I figured each clergy person would kind of take their own take on each of their characters and how their story might be. And so we might overlap. We might have completely different things each week. I have no idea what they're going to talk about with their people. But we kind of went through it chronologically as we went through. So speaking of wilderness, so when you think of the wilderness, what do you think of? This is going to be barren, okay. Loneliness. You're lost. Nature unfettered. Nothingness, okay. Yeah, what else? Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry? Beauty in the scenery, too. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of both. So when you think of the wilderness, do you think of a physical place, typically? You do. Your mind goes to a physical place. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the wilderness is a physical place. I mean, I've been there. You've been there. We're talking now about actual wildernesses, places that are beautiful, but also challenging, can be lonely. If you've ever gone on a long hike or been outside by yourself, some of those things. That's the unique nature of a wilderness. It's good and bad. It's hard and easy. It's challenging and uplifting. It's all of those things together, which kind of sums up how wilderness becomes a metaphor for our lives, right, and our journeys, because ultimately that's what life is. It's these high moments. It's the beautiful and the scenic and the mountains, and then it's the struggle of like, I don't want to take one more step because I'm struggling, and this is barren, and I'm thirsty, and this is not what I want to be doing. And so that's what life is. It's kind of this interplay between those things. And so we think instantly of wilderness as a place. And in the Bible, wilderness is a definitive physical place oftentimes. But does it just have to be a physical place, wilderness? Gates says no. No? Yeah, what else? Gates is pointing at his mind. Yeah, so that's right. I mean, your wilderness could be up here, right? I mean, your wilderness can be a mental wilderness. Your wilderness can be in your heart. I mean, you can find yourself in the wilderness in many different ways and many different times. And so why the wilderness metaphor works, it doesn't have to be a physical place, but the physical place works so beautifully to kind of pull us into the conversation that that's the avenue we take, right? But ultimately, a wilderness can be pretty much anywhere if you come to think about it. Like I said, inside, outside, wherever you might be. And like again, and I think that's good and bad, right? think God uses wilderness too, right? And that's one of the things that this class is about. Like, sometimes wilderness places are the places that we experience God the most intensely, or scared, or and why do you think that is? Why do you think oftentimes it's in these moments of wilderness or actual places of wilderness that we experience God? What would lend itself to that in those moments? Power, absolutely. Sometimes you're humbled. Good things and bad. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very true. Right, because when you're in the wilderness, and let's take a physical one, you are humbled by the sheer scope and size of who God is, right? That God could create the things that God does and do the things that God has done. And if you don't go outside, and if you've never been in British Columbia or a place like that and just look around and be like, holy cow, there is just vastness out here, you realize how infinitely small you really are, right? And that's humbling and also reassuring, because it's like, why do I matter? And then also at the same time, I matter to a God who has billions of these things, like me, right? So it's power. I think it's an acknowledgement of power that you come to in the wilderness. What else? Sorry, Ann? Oh, your need. You're more aware of your needs. Yes, exactly. I think sometimes when other things are stripped away from you, you become a lot more aware of how you need things, right? Like if you don't have water, you become very aware that you need water, right? If you don't have companionship, you're very aware that you need companionship in your life, right? These are things that happen in that way. So what else? No phone reception, right. I would say that's community, though, right? Phone reception is a way for us to connect with other people. And oftentimes, loneliness is one of the hardest parts about wilderness. And you'll see that throughout these stories. Many of the times that the people in the Bible are spending in the wilderness, they're alone at times, right? Jesus, Moses, go on. And I think that probably is one of the hardest things, because when you're alone, you are a lot more likely to lose out to the battle you wage with your own mind, right? Like your mind can just get at you so much better. You can play so many tricks on yourself, and you can have yourself turned around in circles this way and that with your own mind when you don't have other people to talk to and bounce things off of and be a part of community with. So you're much more aware of loneliness in the wilderness. What else?
I think about at risk of your well-being sort of risk.
Yeah, like would you consider that like vulnerable in a sense? Yeah, but your general well-being, your physical, could be your monetary well-being, could be everything.
Yeah, I think you can say, why do we matter? Well, we matter to ourselves.
Yeah.
It's nice, I suppose, that God loves us and everything, but when you're out there in the wilderness and you have no water and you can't figure out a way to go home,
Yeah.
there's a risk that we don't experience when we're driving in our air-conditioned car from
Yeah.
St. John's back to our house on Jefferson Street or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you remove yourself, or you are removed, whether you want to be or not, into a wilderness situation, you definitely, we have a very strong self-survival instinct, right? And we kind of look out for number one. And so when you lose a lot of the comforts and normal things that you are used to, you want to fight back against that. Whether it's your self-worth, like John was talking about, or other things, for sure. So the first person that we kind of think about when we think about wilderness is Moses, right? And that's where we're going to kind of start today. What do you think of when you think of Moses, ultimately? 40 days, 40 years, a lot of different 40s for Moses. 10 Commandments, the wilderness. Yeah, that's right. I picture Charlton Heston. What was that, John? The Exodus, yeah, absolutely. Charlton Heston, the Exodus. We think of Moses ultimately. Because it's probably, outside of Jesus, is it maybe the most well-known story in the Bible? I would say, right? He's a leader, yes. He's a leader, absolutely. And just a fascinating story. I think we're drawn into Moses' story, and we all know the story because of the drama of it. We've seen Charlton Heston do it. We've seen the Prince of Egypt which my kids grew up on that movie, the cartoon version of it. And a fascinating figure. But the thing that's interesting about Moses is I started this class and I started wrestling with this and just thinking about it. And I thought, oh yeah, let's talk about Moses in the wilderness, Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments, Exodus, all of those things, which is obviously a huge part of Moses being in the wilderness. But I thought about the rest of his life too, right? And this idea of being in the wilderness. And, Moses was 120 when he died, right? So he had this perfectly, as someone with some OCD issues and like symmetrical stuff going on, I love the fact that his life was divided into 40s perfectly, right? He spent from 0 to 40 in Egypt, 40 to 80 in Midian, and 80 to 120 in the wilderness with Israel. So he has 3, and I might even wrote this down. I don't know because my computer's over there. Oh, I already talked about that. Yeah, so Moses had 40 years in 3 different wildernesses. And that's kind of how I thought of it, too. I mean, I instantly jumped to the wilderness, and I was like, oh, let's talk about the Exodus and these things. But I kind of want to back up and talk about Moses' start of his life, too, and how his 40 years in Egypt was in wilderness, too. Because think about how he's in a place that's different, right? He's removed. Now, it doesn't mean he's in hardship necessarily. I mean, he hit the jackpot, if you know the story. Someone tell me a bit about the story, if you remember it, how it starts for Moses. So, the basket, yes. The Nile River, yeah, all of these things. I mean, so Pharaoh, the famous ominous line, a Pharaoh rose in Egypt that didn't know Joseph, right? Meaning that Joseph, if you know Joseph's story, had been kind of in with Pharaoh and had this great relationship, interpreted his dreams. Israelites were good, but in time past, like all time does, rulers change, like they always do. And a new ruler came in, a new Pharaoh. They don't even name him. A new Pharaoh came in that did not know Joseph, which was speak for the Israelites are out of luck, right? And so they become an enslaved people to build the things that they want to build in Egypt. And they grew. They must have been hardy people, the Israelites, because it talks about in the Bible how Pharaoh tried hard to kind of keep them from growing, but through the wiliness of some handmaidens and others, these women that were wonderful, they would help the Israelites have children outside of Pharaoh's decree, and Pharaoh just kept getting madder, but the Israelites, the more they were oppressed, the more they grew. Interesting concept, right? The more they were kind of trying to squash who they were as a people, the more they banded together and grew stronger. And Pharaoh doubles down on that, and he says, okay, well, fine, we're going to drown everyone in the Nile that's born to these Israelites. Ironically, the very place where Moses, finds life. So that's the idea. So Moses is born, and of course, if you were a parent, you would be trying to keep your child from being drowned by oppressors. And so they make the basket, put him in the water. He's found by a daughter of Pharaoh who decides to keep him, which is odd. If you think about that in the bigger scope of the story, you're like, man, that was for later on when Pharaoh goes down, he's like, having a daughter, I can understand how that all went, for him. So, Moses' mom, they kind of trick Pharaoh's daughter into allowing her to be the handmaiden for the baby, and Moses is raised in Pharaoh's house, it says, by Pharaoh's daughter, or as one of Pharaoh's, children, Pharaoh's daughter's children. So he grows up in Egypt. Now, I always thought to myself, well, do you think he thought he was Egyptian, or do you think he thought he was one of Israel? Do you think he thought he was Egyptian? Yeah, that would make sense. You would think to yourself, well, you grow up with it. You think, okay, well, you're kind of brought into it. But at the same time, it turns out, and you look at the story a bit, he does seem that way, but then eventually at some point he starts to realize he is. He starts to see the people around him and understand, and I don't even know. Oh, yeah, 40 years in Midian, 40 years in wilderness. We'll get there. I'm over here now, I guess. Oh, yeah. So don't read that yet. So he has this idea. So he's raised in the house of Pharaoh. Now, imagine if you were raised in the house of Pharaoh, what that would probably be like. My guess is he probably was taught and trained and brought about up in the ways. I mean, the Egyptians were smart people, highly skilled warriors, engineers. Unfortunately, they were doing it on the back of slave labor, but these were like Romans much later. They were, so he would have learned a lot to be in that ruling class if he had the opportunities of it. And in fact, there are places where you kind of see this. I mean, and one of my favorite, and so I think to myself, I wonder if Moses kind of grew into this stature of a person who thought that he might be the one to save his own people. Now, we often think about Moses doing that 40 years later, but I think Moses was thinking about it at 40, not just at 80, right? I think at 40, he was starting to realize who his people were, that he had a connection to them, that he knew God and was thinking about trying to do this thing. And, he was the right person. He was 40. Let's say 40's young. I'm going to say 40's super young, right? He was young. He had a military mind. He had been trained. He was intelligent, He was at the peak of his powers. And maybe he was the perfect person at that point to sort of lead his people out of Israel. In fact, one of my favorite descriptions of Moses is in Acts. The best place to read the summation of all of this story in Old Testament is Stephen. He's the best storyteller of the Old Testament there is. In Acts 7, Stephen is about to get stoned for what he says, because they call him out, and he tells the entire story of God and God's people from the beginning. And he's got this wonderful section on Moses where he just kind of sums everything up, and then he basically, what he's doing, along scope of the story, he is telling the leaders of Israel why they've turned on God, and so they stone him for the story. But the story is beautiful, and the way he tells it as his sort of witness to faith is amazing. So he talks about this in Acts 7:20. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months, he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him in and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in speech and in actions. Remember that detail. He was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Now, I want this line right here. Pay very close attention. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. All right? Just a really cool line, because it kind of shows you the thinking of Moses a little bit from Stephen's point of view, but still, I like it. All right? So he was educated, I don't know how to use the pointer on this, educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, powerful in speech and action, and he thought his own people would realize that God was like, okay, I'm the man for the job. I'm going to lead my people out. I'm smart, I'm powerful, I'm strong. I've done all the right things. And he decides, hang on just a sec, John. And he decides that he's going to take matters into his own hands. So he goes out, he sees someone mistreating now it's his people. He sees what happens, and he avenges him and kills the Egyptian. And that's kind of like the start. Well, he's strong enough to just go kill an Egyptian. This is kind of the process. He's like, I'm going to take this in my own hands, and I'm going to do it. John? How does he know? I think in the story, he uses the term kinfolk constantly. God obviously worked on his heart. He knows he came from this. His mother raised him. So I'm assuming his mother, who was his handmaiden, I would assume she would occasionally whisper in his ear, hey, you realize you're not from the Egyptians, right? We came from downstream. That's all right. No, it's true. Those are the good questions, because it's a fascinating story, and it's complex. You're like, imagine the war that was going on inside of Moses, right? He had being raised in Egyptian. As a Semite? Well, yeah, he was part of God's people, yes. Yeah, I don't know how he would identify, but yeah, I think he just thought of himself as part of God's people, but yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, there would be cultural understandings of the difference too. So Moses takes matters into his own hands. He's like, this is the moment for me. And he thinks to himself, all right, I'm the right man for the job. But does it go the way he thinks it's going to go? No, it never does. Never does, right? I mean, we make life is what happens when you make other plans. So Moses makes his plans. Life doesn't go the way he thinks. In fact, that's what I was saying. So surely he's the man to help his people, right? But no, he's not, right? The people turn on Moses. He goes out the next day. They're like, hey, we saw you kill the Egyptian. Not cool, man, right? And he gets freaked out. Pharaoh finds out. He runs for his life. Because, what's your first response when things kind of go to hell in a handbasket in your life oftentimes? You're like, run away, like that fight or flight syndrome. We all have it. It kicks in. And sometimes you are like, let's do this. And sometimes you're like, let's not do this. And that's what Moses does. He runs away. So he spent 40 years in the wilderness in Egypt because ultimately one of the things about wilderness is, again, think about it as a place where you're not comfortable or you're removed from your normal situations, right? Or your normal life. Well, that would be him. So here he is. He spends 40 years in the wilderness there and thinks it's going to go one way. He's the powerful man for the job and does it. So like what would happen to many people, Moses runs. He takes off. He goes to Midian. So Midian, I don't know if I can switch around to different slides. I guess I could come back. But I can tell you a little bit about Midian. Oh, no, went too far. Uh-oh. Sorry, y'all. I was trying to pull up a map, but I can't. I didn't realize you could run off the end of a thing like that. Don't look. Close your eyes. Okay. So this is kind of a map of, this is Egypt right here. And then this is the Sinai Peninsula. And here is Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. And this is where Israel spent most of their time in the wilderness, sort of the wilderness of Paran and Kadesh right here. This is Midian over here. Right here. Don't worry about it. It's right here on Midian. Oh, okay. Down here on the bottom right. I guess we need a stronger pointer. So this is Egypt over here. This is where he is in Egypt. And so, again, when he decides to run away, he definitely takes off. He ends up all the way over here in Midian. And we can talk a little bit about this map while we have it. So eventually he goes back. Oh, obviously, don't do that. He goes back, and then this route here is sort of the route of the Exodus. So, what? If you could just describe it. You can't see that pointer? No, I can see it now. Number 1? Yeah. Okay, number 2. Anyway, this is where he is in Egypt. Number 1. I'll use the numbers. And then number 11 is where he ends up in Midian. Okay? And then he goes back to number 1 in Egypt. And then eventually this is the path of the Exodus, or the supposed path, where crosses the Red Sea here in that Gulf of Suez, and then comes down to Mount Sinai, number 6, Mount Horeb. And then they spend a lot of their time here in the wilderness of Paran and Kadesh. They kind of come here to 11, do a nice little loop, and then eventually they kind of work their way up here. And then this is, of course, Jericho, where the first battle to go into Israel happens, even though we'll talk more about that Abraham doesn't get to go. So that's kind of the flow of the geography in this area. Sorry you can't see the pointer. I don't know. I guess it's easy to see the pointer when you know you're looking. Anyway, so that's kind of the flow of the area. So let's go back. So everything falls apart for Moses. Run away, yeah. And this is a little bit about the Midianites. So Midian was, again, kind of a wilderness area, a desert area. Yeah, it did. I just need to get another one. The battery's running out on this one. I'll pick up or not. There we go. So if you know the story, yes, microphones. If you know the story, then you know he runs away, ends up at the well with Jethro's daughters, and everywhere he goes, there's this idea that everywhere Moses is trying to figure out his sense of justice, and he kind of like has a Egyptian sense of justice about him, in the sense that he's kind of his first thought is conflict. He's not afraid of conflict. He decides the way he's going to go about handling things in Egypt was to kill the Egyptian. He gets into this argument at the well in Midian with a bunch of herders who have brought their sheep there, and they're trying to push past the women who'd gathered there, and he's not having it, so he gets in a conflict with them. But what that does is it gets him an invite home to the home of Jethro, who is sort of the priest leader of the Midianites. And so not only because it gets the invite home, he gets the invite to marry her too. And so he's there, and they marry, and he has children. So he has 40 years now in Midian. 40 years is a long time to think about how things went wrong before, right? And my guess is, how do you think that 40 years in Midian went for Moses? Good? Bad? I mean, there's no wrong answer. Yeah, got a family. He's probably pretty content. Like, he has children. He gets to watch sheep all day and lay in the grass. It sounds kind of nice to me, It's sort of a pastoral, nomadic experience. It's wilderness. So yeah, I think there's probably, like any wilderness, there's probably good parts of it. But my guess would be, too, what do you think else is on his mind at times? Maybe who he is, the people he left behind, who he is. That's always something. Human nature is not to just be totally content in the present. I wish it was, right? Because then we would all be much better off, and we all be much happier people and healthier. But human nature is often to look over our shoulder with regret. Something about us can't help it. And so my guess is he was content in many ways, like we often are, and yet we somehow sometimes kind of struggle with our own contentness because we constantly create issues for ourselves by doing things like looking back in regret and struggling with things that have happened in the past. And that's, oftentimes what wilderness can do to you as well. I think of times where I've wandered a bit in the wilderness, metaphorically and also literally, and you think to yourself, well, I'm going to just focus on the beauty and grandeur of what's in front of me. And where does your mind often go? To like, man, I wish I had done that differently 10 years ago, And it's just like, wait a second. But that's what wilderness does to us. When we're pulled out of our comfort zones and we're challenged, we're uncomfortable, we're not in our normal places, it makes your mind work and your heart work. And my guess is that happens for all of us. My guess is that's happening for Moses. But at the same time, when you're comfortable, maybe you're like, I can live with that, I can be okay with it. I'm going to just kind of stick it out. So Moses gets older. He decides he doesn't want anything with it. And then, I don't even know where I am with my slides anymore. Oh, yeah, there we go. So he runs away. But maybe that wilderness time is a time for him like it is for many of us. I mean, and I think ultimately that's what we'll see in these wilderness stories is that that wrestling sometimes allows us to see more clearly who we are, right? Often maybe one of the reasons all of these things happen in wilderness experiences in the Bible is because when we're kind of, again, vulnerable, like John's talked about, stripped down, pulled out, removed, we are more open to the realities of our lives and also more open to the realities of who we really are, right? There's a keen sense of when everything's sort of stripped away around you, looking and being like, oh, okay, well, that's who I am. And that's how this is going to go, right? And so, obviously, one day he gets to go talk to some shrubbery that's on fire, right? And so God decides, you tried to do it your way 40 years ago. Now we're going to do it my way. And one of the interesting questions that I always wondered about with this is, why now? Why not take the Moses of 40, smart, powerful, could lead the people he lets that Moses go, and he's like, no, don't want that Moses. I want this Moses. I want the 80-year-old Moses who says he has a stutter, doesn't think he can talk, has been out of the game for a while, a little rusty, right? I don't think he's killing any Egyptians, with hand-to-hand combat type stuff. Why does he want this Moses instead of the other one? Any theories? He what? Okay, so we're going to go with the older and wiser. Why older and wiser? Yeah, maybe Moses can see it. Yeah, what's in the? Okay, so God wanted Moses to marinate a little bit. Right. Season. Yeah. Like a fine wine. Aged. Exactly. God wanted Moses to look inside maybe and say, you weren't ready before, and you're going to have to go through a lot of pain and hardship and stuff that's going to kind of strip you down to make you look inside. But now, maybe older, wiser, done some reflecting, maybe now you're ready. And think about that in your own life, right? Think about a time where you thought you were ready and you were gangbusters about it and you were going to do it and you thought everything was going to go just how you planned it would. And then you look back 10 years, 5 years, 20 years later and you're like, well, I was not ready for that at all, right? Not even close. And now I'm kind of ready. At least I'm more ready for whatever reason. Maybe it's age is wisdom. I mean, the older I get, the more I like that argument, right? That you just get wiser with age and you think about these things. But I do think that you grow into an awareness of who you are after you've been through an experience. And maybe Moses had to go through that humiliation in Egypt, running away, finding himself a bit before he was able to really be the leader and the person that God wanted him to be. Right? And I think for us, there's an easy correlation there as we think about, because, we want to dig into these Bible stories. I love Bible stories, as you can tell. I love to dig into them and the details of them. But I also think we want to take something from this class, and that is, how do our lives reflect these stories a bit? And the Moses one, for me, is an easy one, because I've spent a big chunk of my life trying to run away from stuff, I tried multiple times to get out of divinity school. I kept trying to leave it. I was like, I don't want to do this. I'm never working at a church, ever. That's what I told my parents. I was like, I'm not working at a church. I'll go, but I'm not working at a church, okay? I'll work at a camp, I'll teach. But the last thing I'll do is be a parish minister or priest, whatever, So here I am. But, so you just don't know. You run away from things in life, and you try. Yes, that is. Yeah. We'll get to the 10 Commandments. We'll kind of sort that out. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, actually, that's a great point. John's point is great. it wasn't just Moses, it's Israel too. I mean, because if you read the story, it really only starts to talk about Israel groaning under the weight of oppression later. It's not, they definitely up the language, so to speak, because another Pharaoh comes into power, and that Pharaoh even triples down on the oppression. And finally, God's people are like, okay, well, just kidding, we want out of here now. And as we'll see, Israel is the most fickle group ever, right? They want out, they don't want out, they want in, they want out, they want to go back, they want to leave, right? That's just constantly how Israel is. So, yeah, so I think it was a combination. Israel's ready, Moses is ready, and so God decides to come and kind of embark on this journey with Moses. So the next 40 years, he's 80 down, 40 to go.
And I'm thinking, too, on the first 40 years, is a paragraph that says, in Egypt, when he was growing up with Pharaoh, that he had power and speech. He grew in power and speech. So I'm thinking now he's maybe perhaps a little bit more well-known, and he's got some history, but not only just Egypt, but like all over. We saw him traveling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he's definitely more worldly. I mean, in the sense of their little world, right? How far you could walk or whatever. But yeah, I mean, he definitely had been around and had seen things. The comment was, he had kind of seen more, known more, grown more. Absolutely. I mean, you do, for sure. The juxtaposition between the two is interesting, though, how he's strong in speech at 40, and at 80, he's like, hey, Lord, I can't say anything. It's not for me to talk anymore. And God's like, actually, I'll tell you when you're going to talk, right? And I'll tell you what to say. And then there's, and then of course, so it's, it really much kind of sort of magnifies the point that, Moses thought God needed him, right, at 40, and Moses realized that he needed God at 80, right? And that's the difference. Right? That's the difference. And that's the difference in our lives, too. We have moments where we're like, well, God needs me. And then at some point, you find yourself in the wilderness and you're massively humbled and things don't go according. And you're like, actually, just kidding about that. God needs me. I need God. And that's what happens with Moses. Now he's like, I can't do it. I'm not up for it. And God's like, well, good thing I'm here because we're going to do it together, which is what he does in our life, too, ultimately. And then, obviously, I don't even know where I am, but I'm just going to put all these up here. Oh, no, go back. So then 40 years in the wilderness, and again, here, start, my pointer you can't see. I'll start right here. See it? All right. So this is the kind of the route they took. I'm down here at number 7, 8, 9. And this is Mount Sinai. And if you've never read John mentioned the Ten Commandments, which of course is the biggest part of it, but it wasn't just the Ten Commandments. It was a massive amount of covenant teaching that goes on. Like if you've read through it, it's a lot. No wonder Moses stood up there for 40 days while God just kept writing. Here's more, here's more, here's more. And so, this time in the wilderness, the truth is they went very quickly to the borders of the Promised Land. Like quickly. Right after they left Egypt, right? Some people forget that sometimes. They think they got out there, they left Egypt. I've heard people say this to me. They left Egypt, and they're like, they must have had bad navigators. It took them 40 years to get, from here, or to get from here to like right here. Why didn't they just cut across and do this? Well, it wasn't that they were bad at directions. It's that 40 years in the wilderness was their punishment, right? So that's a big difference. Just to be clear, they went quickly to the borders of the Holy Land, and God said, you can take them, and sent Joshua and some spies to go and check it out. And they're like, yeah, it's really fortified. And the biggest issue with Israel was their doubt, right? They doubted God. They did not have faith that God would do what God said. And again, it sounds familiar, right? they were like, yeah, we're not going to win this battle. And God's like, don't worry, I'll fight for you. You're going to win. They say, no way. We're going to do things our way. And the punishment for that, for not trusting God, is 40 years in the desert. So in the wilderness. So there's a little difference there. And, and that's the hard thing about this whole thing. It's not some linear journey. So they spend these 40 years and learning more about who they are and who God is. And in the wilderness stories, it's the pivotal kind of foundational time for God's people. They get the law, most importantly, like John brought up. But they also are sorting out who they are, right? And Moses is still sorting out who he is in some ways. Still trying to figure out what kind of leader he's going to be. He's still struggling with doubt. And so, I think it tells you a little bit, too, that these aren't these nice and tidy categories. You're not like, I was in the wilderness. Now I'm out of it. Things were bad. Now they're good. It's kind of all mixed together. And
Why did they do that loop from 11 to 12 and around? Why did they just go from 11 to...
I wish I knew the answer, because if I did, I'd probably have a PhD somewhere.
That loop tells me they were just literally wandering in the wilderness.
Yeah. That's why they were wandering in the wilderness. Yes. It is. I don't know. I don't know. I've seen most of these maps. I don't know how accurate they really are. I mean, we're talking about, yeah, they probably just were wandering around looking for things. Now, I mean, the Kadesh Wilderness, there's a range that runs from the Sinai Peninsula up through that kind of sort of Kadesh and into Zin. But if you've been there, and Eric can speak to it better than I can, it is rugged terrain. I mean, mountain is a strong word, but it's mountainous. Yeah. Yeah, but again, this is just to help you get some reference. I don't get into the minutia of this, because I don't know exactly. I wasn't there charting it, and I don't think they were charting it either. No GPS. Yeah, these are probably rough approximations. But what I wanted you to see was kind of how they traveled and where they were. So they spent 40 years. And so I think what I want to start with this too is, just to finish up for the next few minutes, is, I think one of the hardest things about Moses' story for me is the fact that he never gets out of the wilderness, right? Because I think in our lives, we think to ourselves that wildernesses are just places to go, and things are tough and hard, and we kind of work it out. We have this experience with God, and then we leave. But, there are also times when you don't leave the wilderness in your life, right? And so the reason Moses doesn't go is, after all he had done for and with God, he too lacks faith in the end, right? I mean, the story is, there's a rock. It seems a little petty to me, but, there's a rock, and God tells Moses to pray to the rock so that water will come out of it, and it'll show the people that God is powerful. And instead, Moses takes his staff and he hits the rock and he splits it in two, and the water comes out that way, but he didn't do it the way God asked him to do it. So his punishment was that he doesn't get to go and actually walk into the promised land. Joshua will take them in. Seems harsh, but, so here after all this, Moses still was in the wilderness. And so the thing I wanted to kind of end with, too, as we have weeks of this, and we'll hear some similar themes, and which is okay, I think. I think this is something worth kind of dwelling in and journeying through, is you don't always leave wildernesses, too. And so how do you find faith and joy and hope in those things, right? I was sitting Friday night with my neighbor. He's a little younger than me, and we were outside just hanging out, and he gets a phone call, and he's got a brother who's my age who has found out in the phone call, we're standing there, stage 4 cancer, right? So he's my age, his brother, and I met him. He's a nice guy. In his face and neck, this cancer. So he'll never leave the wilderness, probably, right? He'll never leave it. And so the question becomes, what now, right? What now with faith? What now with hope? What now with joy? These are hard questions, and I know I'm bringing things up, and I'll be like, all right, let's wrap it up. Thanks, everybody. No, but I do want to wrestle with these things with you all some in the weeks ahead and think about them, because there are times, that's why it's not these perfect, neat categories. We'll be in and out of wildernesses. There are some we'll never leave, but there's some that we will. And there's always going to be moments where you're kind of broken down and you'll find healing, and there's moments you might not find ever fully healing in this side of God recreating this world and bringing things to fulfillment. So Moses had this going on in his life too. What a faithful servant, and it doesn't mean he didn't find joy and happiness, but also he continually wrestled like we do in our wildernesses with who he was. And did he trust God? Was God going to be faithful? Was God going to live up to God's promises? And you'll see in these stories as we go forward that that's a recurring theme. Like, is God trustworthy? Is God faithful? Can we trust God to do what God says God's going to do? And a lot of times the problems we get into in our lives is where we don't trust God to do that. That we think that we have to take control of our own situation, and we try to manipulate it or do whatever we need to do rather than trying to see what God might be up to. And that's why we end up in so many different wildernesses in our lives. And that's what happened to Moses. His first one, it wasn't his fault, but 3 wildernesses, 40 years, in all of those different ways. So we didn't talk as much about his Exodus wilderness. We could talk about that for a long time. But for some reason, was drawn to Egypt and Midian more. So questions about Moses and his wilderness wanderings? Thoughts? All right. Well, we're going to keep talking about it, and like I said, we'll have many chances. I think King David might be next week. Another fascinating, flawed, wonderful person from the Old Testament. So, John? Yeah, quick. I wouldn't expect anything less than a gotcha question. I don't think God needs to punish us, because I think when we don't have faith in... What's that? Yeah, but there was a very different arrangement between God and God's people in that time. I think in our world today, God doesn't need to worry about punishing us, because the results of our decisions manifest themselves and create all the punishment we need. You know what I mean? Like, that's not God saying, I'm going to punish you because you did this. It's more, we do this, and bad things happen because we do it, and then God comes to us in that to be with us in it, being almost like Paul talks about in the New Testament. He's like, oh, you want to do it your way? Okay, but let me just tell you, when you do it your way, this is what's going to happen. And we do it our way anyway, and it happens. It's that have it your way thing. And we want it our way, and then when that happens, thankfully we have a God who comes to us alongside in that. No matter the fact we've done it, and we were told not to do it, we do it anyway, and then we do it again, and then we do it again after that, and yet we have a faithfulness of a God who just comes back. And that was the faithfulness of the God that walked with Moses. I mean, Moses was not perfect, and yet God worked in and through Moses to have this crucial kind of role in leadership for God's people. So, fascinating story, and like I said, I love to kind of dig into it too. So thanks for coming. Come back next week. We'll go on to our next character. We'll move on from there. So, all right, if you're going to church, have a nice day. Yeah, thanks, y'all.